So let me deviate a bit out of the exact review of the book, but relate it to the context, both in regional and global politics, and also of the state of the Sri Lankan political and economic landscape of the current situation. This book has, as Honorable State Minister said, 3 segments: the past, the present, and the future. The history part, the literature review on the history is very well footnoted and researched work. It has very renowned names of Dr. Vernon Mendes, Lona Devaraja, and so on and so forth. It elaborates how Sri Lanka, in our 1,000 or 2,000 years of history, how we cooperated, traded, and had very strong relationship with the Arab world, starting from pre-Islamic era. And it elaborates, quoting Dr. Lona Devaraja, about the title Thanapati Gedaralage, how it started. And it's a title of Muslim community, I heard in Kandy. It's very interesting, and the quote goes on to say the first foreign minister of Sri Lanka happened to be a Muslim, carrying that legacy. Ironically, or by default or whatever, even the current foreign minister is from the same community. But if you look at the history, I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I love to learn this. These historic bonds were very strong between Sri Lanka and Arab, the Muslim nation. In one of the radio talk shows by Professor Raj Somadeva, he is running a massive series of talk shows every Monday. I never miss that. On net radio for about 2 hours, elaborating the history and review and analyzing the situation. In one of his talk shows in recent episodes, he elaborated how Oman, Egypt, and Sri Lanka had the relationship, I think in 14th century, during the Ambadeniya kingdom. Apparently, it happened to be the time that I got your book as well. So it's really correlated, the content of the book. Professor, I quote him, he says, the Sultan of Oman sent an emissary to Buhanekabahu I, I think, in Dambadeniya, with a proposal for a free trade agreement in the present context, asking for spices, a trade on spices, specifically targeting pepper and cinnamon. And the king, Sri Lankan king Buhanekabahu I, he already had a pact with Egypt by that time, because trading with Egypt was more lucrative than Oman. Mahavansa says the king, Buhanekabahu, did not want to hurt the feelings of the emissary from Oman. So it's very clearly say, without hurting the feelings of the emissary, the king explained that we have a pact already with Egypt and we don't want to disturb that. In fact, it was not want to disturb that. According to the review or analysis of Professor Raj Somadeva, he says, if you have a pact with Egypt, you can't have a pact with another Arab country. That was the understanding. King Buhanekabahu did not stop there. After returning the emissary from Oman, he sent another emissary to Egypt, carrying the message that we had an emissary from Oman with the proposal, but I managed to turn him back, so we are not violating our understanding with Egypt. This is what you call transparency in today's context. What the international community demands from us today is transparency, which we lacked for many decades in Sri Lanka. When we are dealing with our friendly nations, our international relations. I don't think we were transparent enough in dealing with matters of sensitive nature. We are paying the price of that today, especially with countries like Japan. That's exactly what Honorable Foreign Minister said now. Even on the measures were taken, some measures that were taken after 2019 were not transparent, were not justifiable, and now he is doing his maximum to correct those mistakes. In the past, our kings, our rulers maintained that transparency. That's why he sent an emissary to Egypt to explain the matters. According to Fukuyama, the state has two main characteristics. One, rule of law. Second, democratic accountability. Today we are celebrating, in less than 3 weeks' time, we are celebrating our 75th anniversary, our independence. But unfortunately, as a bankrupt nation, that's the truth. Here we have a lot of ambassadors, foreign ambassadors and our own ambassadors. For our own ambassadors, for a fact, it's a very tough time to face the outside world. We are represented in outside world, in our forums, as not as a successful nation, but we are, I don't want to use the term failed state, it has a different connotation, but we are not successful state. So we are not carrying strength. We are not carrying dignity. So the task, I'm sure, of the foreign ministry, especially the two ministers here, they are carrying is extremely heavy, I think second to the President of Sri Lanka. Rebuilding the image, the reputation of Sri Lanka. Why? Because we did not have rule of law and accountability. Rule of law, on my own interpretation, I'm sorry to say this in front of a Supreme Court, former Supreme Court judge and the President's Council, but for me, rule of law is the desire, today's context, the law is the desire of the ruler. If he decide, I will use this law to do this particular thing, he will do that. But that's not what we mean by rule of law. That's what we need in this country. The democratic accountability system is yet to be established institutionally in Sri Lanka. That's what we need in Sri Lanka, and that's what our international friends, including International Monetary Fund, saying us. We have failed to do that. But our rulers, our kings, were successful in that. That's how we did trading, that's how we did bilateral relations, multilateral relations for thousands of years. But after independence, we have totally neglected that path, and we have done entirely the opposite. The other part is talking about the future. And Mr. Amir Ajwad proposed in his book that we should move out of the traditional dealings with our friends, especially with Oman, but definitely from in our other international relations as well. Of course, we heard the name of Felix de Silva, the first IGP of Oman. Not only Oman, we have the former ambassadors to Malaysia and many countries here. If you go to Malaysia, who built the foreign service, the public service, the transport service of Malaysia? It was Sri Lankans. Sri Lankan made the history of these countries. But today, what are we exporting? Cheap labor. So this is something we have to review. Last year was a turning point of Sri Lanka. Not only for Sri Lanka, don't just focus on Sri Lanka. 92 countries in the world had their public protests. 92 countries. Some had regime changes also, including Sri Lanka. Indonesia did this 25 years ago to oust Suharto after 36 years of rule. If you look at Indonesia, by the end of this year, Indonesia will be the 5th largest economy in the world after failing the economy, but having a very strong reform process. Suharto, with his knowledge of the protests, he knew he has to go. So he appointed his confidante, Habibi, as his vice president. He made sure that the presidency is replaced by Habibi. Why? For the safe exits of Suharto. So Habibi became the president, and there was a massive pressure on Habibi to take action against Suharto family. But Habibi never did that. After even 25 years, nothing has happened to Suharto's family. But Habibi did one thing. He announced the date of election immediately. And then he said, I'm going to start the reform process from now. And that reform process did not only focus economic reforms. That included political, social reforms. I'm coming from the field of media, and that reform included media reform, because that time the Indonesian media was so corrupt, so captured by the political interest. So they wanted to reform media. Today the Indonesian Press Council and Indonesian Broadcast Council are the landmark case studies for Asia on independence. So Habibi launched this massive reform process, and then came Abdul Wahid. No disturbance, those were national policies, continued, and even up to now, Jokowi, the reform process continued. After 25 years, Indonesia is becoming the 5th largest economy in the world because of the reform process. We are yet to see that happen in Sri Lanka. We know there are economic reforms, but economic reforms is not the answer, only answer. We wanted a system change. That's a buzzword that happened. So system change means reform in the entire process. It's not the business as usual. Even now, yes, we see some relief, no petrol queues, no major calamity on the roads, but it doesn't mean everything is hunky-dory. Without political reforms, without structural reforms, I don't think we can have these success stories for Sri Lanka. Even after 25 years, if you look at Argentina, how many years now? More than 25 years, still defaulting. Still. Of course, they won the World Cup. But what happened to the economic reform process? Not a success story. So Sri Lanka is not the only country. So that's why the books like this are extremely important to shed some light to the future. I don't want to take much of your time, but these 2 years, starting from this January, we will see a lot of elections. Not only in Sri Lanka. This will be the year of elections. These 2 years will be the years of election for entire Asia, starting from India, May next year. That election will be very decisive, even for Sri Lanka. Indonesia will have elections, Valentine Day next year, Bangladesh, January next year. So all Pakistan this year. So we are going to face a lot of elections. What does it mean? People practice democracy. People will have a choice. Definitely people will have a choice, but they don't have leaders. If you take India, there is no competitive race. If you take Indonesia, President Jokowi is joining hand with whom? Suharto's son-in-law, the present defense minister. Hopefully he will be the presidential candidate in Indonesia with the blessings of Jokowi. Look at what happened in Philippines. We have to think the new era of Asia. That, as I repeatedly said, the top 5 economies, out of 5 top economies in the world, 4 will be from Asia. India, China, Japan and Indonesia. Only US will be out of Asia. So entire economic hub is turning to Asia. How are we going to benefit out of this? This is what I like in Ambassador Amir Rajwar's book about future. Because he suggests to think out of the box, take into new arenas, take new challenges, go to untraditional trading with the countries. And these are not his opinion. He is getting experts to say this story. So I hope our policymakers, decision makers will have some ears and eyes to listen to him. Without taking much of time, I want to conclude with an experience I had day before yesterday. Honorable Minister, I was at a party where to felicitate and bid farewell to a doctor who is migrating. So, in that party we had a lot of doctors. I don't want to mention the hospital. One young doctor who was known to me from school days, and he came to me and asked, "Aiye, tell me your candid opinion. Should I stay or leave this country?" So I looked at him. I know he has 2 young kids, 3 and 5. So I said, "What should I say?" I have no answer to you. Then I asked him, "Why do you think to leave? What is the reason?" Then he said 2 things. Number 1, I have 2 kids. What is the guarantee that you can give me that my kids will not curse me after 15 years, that you had the opportunity to go out of this country, you did not, and we are in the mess today? Second reason, these are nothing to hide. This is the status of the country, and this is the status that we have to avoid. Second reason, he said, I am working in the ICU. There are 12 doctors in the ICU with 2 consultants. Out of these 12, 9 has already planned to go and they are in the process. 6 gone, 3 in the fray. So there will be only 3 doctors in my ICU. Out of the 2 consultants, 1 has already gone, only 1 consultant. So we have the building called hospital, but a lack of drugs and no doctors. So how can we face this? My counter question to him, if you leave this country, who is going to take this country out of this mess? This is our responsibility. You studied from the taxpayers' money. Of course, now we are in the same mess. And we are in the same boat. We are having plans to get this country out of this mess and develop this country, rebuild Sri Lanka. Who is going to take the responsibility? That's all, but no answers. I know this poor fellow is in a massive fix. This is people are moving not because they don't like to move, because they don't have opportunities in this country. They don't see. But the efforts of Sri Lankans should be to find this country back on track. I don't know how to do it. We have to have a massive national plan. And the diplomats here, the ambassadors here, our own ambassadors, I'm sure we have to rethink. I'm not talking politics. It's not about politics. How to build Sri Lanka. I don't want to use the word rebuild. In last closing remarks, let me give some experiences. As Factum, our own think tank, led by our chief analyst Udita Devapriya, who is present here now, we are doing a small survey around the country about the foreign policy in Sri Lanka. How to, just to get some glimpse how grassroots people think about foreign policy. So we went to Hambantota first, grassroots, with a group of 35, 40, about 40 people. One young fellow was talking about marketing diplomacy. He said, sir, forget about these traditional diplomatic norms. Sri Lanka should get on to marketing diplomacy. Wow. So during the lunchtime, we cornered the fellow and I said, where do you work? He said, no, sir, I'm not working. I'm still doing my A-levels. So the subject of foreign policy is no more confined to Sri Lanka and foreign ministry. We have to take people into that. And then we went to Jaffna. Old leftist think tanks, So I was doing my closing remark. I said, let's rebuild Sri Lanka, Jaffna, Batiklo, wherever you come, let's rebuild this country. Then one old gentleman raised his hand. He said, please withdraw your statement. I was shocked. I said, why? No, don't rebuild Sri Lanka. That Sri Lanka was never a success. It had blood, it had animosity, it had vengeance, it had war. So don't rebuild that. We don't want that Sri Lanka. Let's build a new Sri Lanka and take us into that platform as Jaffna Tamil Sri Lankans. So even in my mind, I changed my narrative. That's true. The 75-year-old Sri Lanka is not a success. So we need a new Sri Lanka. We need new young leaders to think new and think out of the box. I'm not rejecting the current political leaders. That's not the idea of my discussion. But we need a new young blood to the system to think new and start new. This is the generation of different information, digital landscape. We have to think like them. That's why, in that context, that's why we appreciate the effort of Ambassador Ami Rajwad, where you find new dynamism in the relations between Sri Lanka and Arab nation. As Honorable Minister said, we have to do a lot of damage controlling, corrections that had happened. I know how difficult it was for him to fight from within in some decisions that were made during that time. So we always stand by those correct decisions. And Ambassador Ami Rajwad, thank you again for making this effort. And thank you for inviting me. I think we all have to start thinking new and get that two components of state building, democratic accountability and rule of law. Thank you.
රස්සාවල් නැති තරුණයින් දරුවන් දමා රට යන අම්මලා කන්න නැති දරුවන් ඒත් පාලකයන් දේශපාලන බලාරගලයක ඇත්තටම මේ රට හදන්නේ කොහොමද සිතන්න